Hello, everyone. In this chapter, we are going to address ecology and the nature of ecosystem. How are living organisms in a given ecosystem are interacting among themselves and how they are interacting with their environment. And particularly because we are in a case of human biology, how do we human have impact on our environment, our ecosystems? So we are going to address all of this. Now, the learning outcomes, we're going to first of all define what an ecosystem is, what are the different components of an ecosystem. We are going to talk about the energy flow in that ecosystem and the chemical cycling, because these two are essential for maintaining the balance of an ecosystem. We are going to then dive into the major types of ecosystems, including terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. We will define the different types of terrestrial ecosystems and the different types of aquatic ecosystems. Then we will move on looking into the food web and the pyramid of energy in that food web. Then we are going to address the biogeochemical cycle of elements in the ecosystem. Now, why biogeochemical? Bio for biology, geo for earth, right? And the cycling of the chemicals go through biological systems and the terrestrial system. We're going to address some very specific chemicals or compound that are involved in that biogeochemical cycle. And finally, we are going to dive into the impact of human in that biogeochemical cycle of elements. So, first up, let's define what an ecosystem is. Now, before actually we dive into the ecosystem, let's first of all look into the biosphere. Now, you remember at the very beginning of this course, we said that life can be looked at on a size scale basis. We can look at life from the atomic perspective, the molecular perspective, the cellular perspective, and so on, until the very most inclusive level, which is biosphere, right? So let's start with the biosphere. What is a biosphere? A biosphere, it's basically all the regions on Earth, including water, crust, and the atmosphere, where we are going to find living systems thriving. Now, this biosphere is going to be made up of many different types of ecosystem, whether you are on the equator line of Earth or you are on the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, right? We're going to have different types of ecosystems. But what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a geographical area where organisms are interacting with each other, but also interacting with their environment, right? How do we define these different interactions, right? So that's what an ecosystem is, right? So we are going to find in ecosystem living components and non-living components. These are the two essential parts of an ecosystem. Now, with that being said, when we consider the biosphere, there are really two major types of ecosystems. We have terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. In the terrestrial ecosystems, we are going to have several types of ecosystems. Basically, they are going to be classified based on temperature and the amount of water available or rainfalls, right? So, the water types of terrestrial ecosystems is going to, the major types of terrestrial ecosystems are also going to be called biomes, right? We are going to take a look at the major types of biomes in a terrestrial ecosystem. But before we dive in that, let me tell you that in an aquatic ecosystem, we are going to have two major types of ecosystems. We're going to have freshwater ecosystems and the marine ecosystem. So the next step at this point, it's going to be the different types of terrestrial ecosystem or the different types of biomes that you find in the terrestrial environment. So in the terrestrial environment, we are going to have forests that are dominated by trees, and we are going to have grasslands that are dominated by grass, right? So in the first type of ecosystem, the forest ecosystem, now we are going to have multiple types of biomes, right? We're going to have, for instance, the tropical rainforest biome or ecosystem. This is going to be determined or dominated by large trees, right? Those large trees, most of the time, are going to be evergreen. So throughout the year, these trees are going to carry green leaves. And these leaves oftentimes are going to be broad. So big trees, evergreen, broad leaves, right? So this defines a tropical rainforest. And a tropical rainforest is going to be dominated by relatively high temperatures, high moist, right? Humidity, and a relatively high abundant rainfall almost throughout the year. So that's one type of biome of the terrestrial environment. Then we are going to have the coniferous forest. The coniferous forests are also called taiga. So taiga typically occur in the northern part of the hemisphere where it is cold, right? But you're going to have trees such as pine trees, spruces, hemlocks that are going to dominate that environment. So in the northern area where these coniferous forests are going to be found, temperatures are going to be overall cold almost throughout the year, right? That's why this forest cannot be really dominated by large leaves trees, for the single reason that the larger the trees, the leaves are, the more evaporation is occurring, considering the fact that these trees are occurring in places where water is scarce because of the fact that it is frozen rather than being liquid. Well, the adaptation of these trees is to have leaves that are very small, right? Well, let me close that parenthesis. Then we're going to have temperate deciduous forests. Deciduous means that these trees are going to have some seasons in the year where they keep their leaves, and other seasons in the year where they lose their leaves, right? We have fall, typically, when they're going to lose their leaves, and we have spring and winter and summer, where they are going to keep their leaves, right? Deciduous, because sometimes they keep their leaves, sometimes they lose their leaves. Now, in the grasslands, we are going to have tropical grasslands. Tropical grasslands are also called savannas. So, savannas don't typically have large trees. They're going to have small trees, shrubs, if you will, right? Then we're going to have temperate grasslands, also called prairies, right? Prairies are very similar to tropical grassland, except that prairies occur in in temperate areas, right? While tropical grassland obviously occur in the tropics and on the equator. All right. Finally, among the terrestrial biomes, we're going to have the deserts. The deserts are characterized by the scarcity of water or moisture, right? So now here we are going to have scarcity of water or moisture for two reasons. One, it can be that water is frozen so much that most of the time that water is not available, right? This is typically what we're going to find in the northern hemisphere, but at the very top of the globe, we're going to call these biomes tundra. These are cold deserts where we are going to have permafrost. And the permafrost, it's a layer of the earth where water is frozen throughout the year, right? So because of that, well, you're typically not going to have trees or big trees because just the lack of water is not going to support the need for this big tree. So you're going to have that. These are cold deserts, right? And then we have hot deserts, right? The hot deserts are going to be found in the tropics, right? We have the Sahara Desert, the Kalahari Desert, right? So there, water is going to be scarce because it's just too hot, right? Evaporation happens almost like this, right? So plants that thrive in these environments are going to be plants that know how to preserve water, save water for long period of time because you don't really have rainfalls. You hardly have rainfalls throughout the year. All right. So this slide actually shows you the many types of biomes you are going to find in the terrestrial environment, including up here where we are going to have the tundra, where this is going to be a cold desert, right? Then underneath, you're going to have taigas, okay? Where even though it's cold, but it's less cold than in the tundra, right? So this is where you're going to find coniferous forests. Then we are going to have the temperate deciduous forest, right in these areas, temperate deciduous forest. And we're going to have rainforest, okay, and tropical deciduous rainforest. So right here, okay. So if you notice, this is the equator line. All right. So the tropical deciduous forest are going to be on the tropics, right? Then we are going to have the tropical rainforest that is very abundant in 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 uh, in the South Americas, in Africa, in the Pacific Rim, right? We're going to have savannas, okay, in different places of the globe, okay? We're going to have savannas, and we're going to have deserts, such as in this area right here, right? In this areas right here. So we have here a rainforest. We have here a taiga. We have here a deciduous a deciduous temperate forest. And we are going to have here some mountainous area, and the the ecosystem is different in these places. All right, so let's take a look at the aquatic ecosystems. In the aquatic ecosystems, we're going to have the marine ecosystems. In the marine ecosystem, we're going to have seashores. This is where tides are going up and down. So these areas are sometimes underwater, sometimes exposed to the atmosphere, right? And this is going to be areas where water is contain bunch of salt. Then we're going to have oceans, big open oceans. We're going to have coral reefs and estuaries. Now, what do we call estuaries? Estuaries, it's these areas where fresh water is meeting salt water, right? These areas are also going to be characterized by tides that go up and down. And these areas are going to be the areas in the marine environment that supports almost the entire life in the remainder of ecosystem, because this is where a lot of organisms come and find food. They come when the tide is high to find food, and they go away when the tide is low, right? And this areas is particularly ideal because you have fresh water meeting salt water, and you just have an ideal condition for living organism in an aquatic environment to thrive. So this is a place that we have to do whatever it takes to preserve in order to maintain a certain balance in the marine environment. Then we're going to have freshwater ecosystem. In freshwater ecosystem, we have standing water. In the standing water, we're going to have lakes and ponds. And then we have water that flows. This is where we are going to find rivers and streams. And the major difference between rivers and streams is that rivers are larger than streams. So streams flow and forming at some point a river, and a river is going to flow down and dump its content in oceans and seas. All right, so here we have an ocean ecosystem. We have down here a coral reef. That is an area where many organisms are going to also thrive, because typically there is a bunch of food there. We have right here a river ecosystem, and here we are going to have marshes. All right, so as we consider an ecosystem, I did tell you that you have two major components in ecosystem. We have living components and non-living components. So non-living components are also called abiotic components. A means without, biotic life. So abiotic, without life. So these are non-living components of an ecosystem. And some examples of non-living components are going to be water, wind, rocks, soil. These are some examples of abiotic components. Then we are going to have biotic components. Biotic components are all living organisms that are found in an ecosystem. Now, as we consider the living organisms, we are going to classify them based on the role they play in that ecosystem. Some are what we call producers. These producers typically are going to rely on the sun for source of energy, right? And from that energy, they are going to use carbon dioxide to actually make their their carbon-based components, right? Including sugars and more complex components, right? These organisms, because they rely on the sun for source of energy and carbon dioxide for source of carbon, they are going to be called autotroph organisms, right? These are producers. Then, these producers are at the very base of the ecosystem, if you will, or the food chain, if you will. Then you are going to have other organisms that rely on these producers. And these are other organisms that rely on producers. They rely on them for food and energy. They are going to be called consumers. Because consumers rely on other organisms, they are therefore heterotrophs. Hetero means others. Troph means feeding, right? They are feeding on other organisms. While auto means self, troph means feeding. They are self-feeding, so they are providing food for themselves. They are seeking food for themselves, right? Now, in the heterotrophs, organisms or consumers, there we are also going to have different levels, different categories, right? Based on at which level they are feeding. We're going to have herbivores. Herbivores are going to feed on plants and algae. Basically based on, are we in an aquatic environment or are we on a terrestrial environment, right? Then we are going to have carnivores. Carnivores are these consumers that are feeding on other animals. Then we have another category that is omnivores. Omnivores, they eat about anything. They eat plants. They eat animals. Can you think of any organism that is an omnivore? Well, humans, right? You are omnivores because you eat plants and you eat animals. And then we have detritus feeders. They are also called detritivores or decomposers. Let me repeat that. Detritus feeders are also called detritivores or decomposers. These decomposers are going to decompose organic matter. In other words, when other organisms are dead, these decomposers are the ones that are going to break apart this dead organism that were at one time alive, right? So some examples of decomposers are bacteria. Other examples of decomposers are fungi. I want you to remember that. All right, so then in an ecosystem, we are going to ask for, when it comes to living organisms at least, we are going to ask the following question. How is a given organism fitting in its ecosystem? The role an organism or a species plays in an ecosystem is going to define what we call its niche, right? Now, as we look at the role a species plays in an ecosystem, we are going to ask the following question. How does this species get food? All right? So that's a question. What does it eat? That's another question. And finally, how does it interact with other organisms? That's another question. So, in interactions, now we are going to take a look at two types of interaction. We're going to take a look at intra-specific interaction, meaning within the same species, how do organisms are interacting with each other? That's one way of looking at things. The other way of looking at things, or the other level, rather, it's how does a particular species of organism interacting with other species of organisms, right? So all of this is going to define the role of an organism or a species in a given ecosystem. So here we have pictures of producers, right? Producers in aquatic environment, producer in a terrestrial environment. Then we are going to have herbivores, including a caterpillar here that is feeding on leaves, a rabbit here that is feeding on leaves or flowers, okay? We're going to have carnivores with a snake here feeding on a squirrel, an elk here feeding on a snake, and then we're going to have decomposers, bacteria being some decomposers, and fungi being other decomposers. Now, we talked about the biotic components and the abiotic components in ecosystem. Now, how do these two components are interacting with each other? Well, this is now where we are going to talk about the energy flow in an ecosystem and the chemical cycling in an ecosystem. Now, know that an ecosystem is a dynamic environment. And for that ecosystem to be maintained, the dynamic environment is going to be relying on two major things: the cycling of chemicals and the flow of energy. First, let's stop on the flow of energy. The flow of energy always goes from producers to consumers. It's a unidirectional flow. Unidirectional flow, so one direction, right? the energy flows from producers to consumer. And one detail I want you to remember why this energy flows in one direction, it's that a consumer cannot give back the energy to the producer. That is not possible. Likewise, a producer cannot give back the energy that is necessary for its growth to its original source, that is the sun, right? So all the energy that is found in an ecosystem can be boiled down to the sun or can be traced back to the sun, right? So the sun provides energy for producers. These producers are going to use that energy for making the components that are necessary for growth and reproduction. Eventually, some of the energy from the sun is going to be lost in the process as heat. And that heat, is not used for anything, is not going to be made available for the next trophic level. All right? So you understand that, that heat is not going to play any role in the energy component in the ecosystem. So producers are going to be source of food for the consumers. Here we have a rabbit and a fox, right? The rabbit is going to feed on producers. The fox is going to feed on the rabbit, right? Now, in terms of energy, as the fox feeds on the rabbit, some of the energy that it gets from eating a rabbit is going to be lost as heat. Others is going to make the muscles and the tissues in the fox, right? This muscles and tissues in the fox, it's a source of energy that is going to be made available in an ecosystem. And this is what decomposers are going to feed on, right? So the decomposers are going to obtain energy feeding on the remaining of a fox and a dead rabbit. Now, as they are obtaining that energy, some energy is going to be lost as heat, right? While the chemicals are going to stay in the ecosystem. Now, the producers are also going to die and provide energy for decomposers. So energy flows one way in an ecosystem. I want you to remember that. Now, let's talk about chemicals. Now, the chemicals that are in the producers are going to be obtained by the consumers, including herbivores, right? Now, these herbivores are going to be source of chemicals for carnivores, right? Now, these herbivores and carnivores, they don't just eat, they defecate, they pee, right? All of that goes back in the ecosystem, right? So the chemicals remain in the ecosystem at all time. These chemicals, as these organisms, the consumers die and the producers die, the chemicals are going to be in the ecosystem and used by decomposers. These decomposers themselves are going to die. They are going to do chemical processes that actually return the chemicals in the ecosystem so that we always have a pool of chemicals in the ecosystem. These chemicals can be organic, these chemicals can be inorganic. Either way, they are going to be part of that ecosystem, and these chemicals are always in that ecosystem unless we disturb that ecosystem. How so? This can happen because, for instance, one species went extinct, right? So if you have loss of one species in an ecosystem, this is going to alter the balance in an ecosystem, because the role that organism was playing in that ecosystem, that organism is not playing that role anymore. So the chemicals that this organism were processing, they are not processing these chemicals anymore, right? That is a major loss. That's why anytime you have loss of species in an ecosystem, the balance in that ecosystem necessarily change. All right. So the food that living organisms obtain in an ecosystem is going to be the source of energy, but it's also going to be the source of nutrients for the organism to grow and reproduce. So really, there are multiple functions for the food that living organisms obtain in an ecosystem. So let's take a look at here the case of an herbivore that is obtaining food from an ecosystem. So that herbivore eats plants, right? So the energy that is gathered from that is going to be used for some of it in cellular respiration. The energy that is used in cellular respiration will never be available to any organism that is going to feed on this herbivore. So that's one thing that is very important to remember. Some of the energy here is going to be lost as heat to the environment, right? So this is not made available to whoever is going to eat that herbivore. Then you have some of the energy that is released in the form of defecation, right? The organism that is feeding on an herbivore is not feeding on the defecation, the feces. No, they're not, right? They pee, okay? And they die and decompose, right? So all of this energy goes to the detritivores, all right? Now, the only energy that goes to the consumer of this herbivore is going to be the energy that goes toward growth, but not the one that goes toward reproduction, right? So that energy that goes toward growth is the reason why muscles are going to develop in this herbivore, and that muscles, it's what you eat, right? So that's the energy is made available to you when you eat, for instance, a deer, right? So it is estimated that for a given meal that a herbivore is going to obtain, only about 10% of that energy is going to account for the energy that is made available to the next trophic level. For you, for instance, the carnivore, right? All right. So the energy flow in an ecosystem is going to be structured in terms of trophic levels. So in trophic levels, we are going to have producers, we're going to have consumers, And in terms of consumers, we are going to have different levels of consumers. We're going to have consumers that feed on herbivores, right? Actually, no. Let me step back. You're going to have herbivores that feed on producers, right? That's the primary or the first trophic level. Then we're going to have consumers that feed on herbivores. That's the second trophic level. Then you are going to have a third trophic level of carnivores that feed on the organism that feed on producers, right? So that's the second trophic level. And then we're going to have a third trophic level, right? We are going to address that. Actually, no, let's do it now. So we have producers, that's one level. We have primary consumers, we have secondary consumers. In some ecosystems, we can have tertiary, quaternary consumers. But in an ecosystem, the trophic levels are limited because of the amount of energy that is made available to the next trophic level, right? Let me stop there. So the food web, it's very complex. The food web is very complex because one organism does not always feed on one single type of organism, right? They're going to have different sources of food. And the reason why they're going to have different sources of food, it's because if they were to rely on one single type of source of food, that would limit their ability to thrive and reproduce and leave behind offsprings, right? So that's why, rather than just, being on a trophic level, we are going to talk about food web, because really the interactions are much more complex, right? We're going to have in a food web a grazing food web and a detrital food web. Grazing food web, so basically from a grazing animal, right? You are going to have different components. We're going to have different components there that are going to feed on something else. I'm going to show you with graphic representation in a minute. And the detritivores are also going to have a very complex interaction with their environment when it comes to food consumption. So we have the pyramid of energy, ecological pyramid or pyramid of energy. So that pyramid of energy is actually going to reflect the loss of energy as we go from one trophic level to another trophic level. So I was telling you earlier that for a given meal, only about 10% of the energy from that meal is going to be made available to the next trophic level. Okay? So here we have a food web. So we have a grazing food web here, where we are going to have that the oak tree here is going to be the source of food for many different organisms, including the caterpillar, the bird, okay, the mouse, the chipmunk. So you see that the oak tree is not source of food for one single organism. It's source of food for many organisms. They eat different components of that oak tree. So that makes it very complex. If you consider the chipmunk right here, the chipmunk is source of food for this oak here, for this owl here, for this fox here, okay? So you are going to have a very complex relationship in this grazing food web. Now, in the detritus feeding food web, the interaction is going to be as well complex, right? Because these detritus feeders are going to feed on many components, right? They're going to feed on different components here that die, right? We're going to have the salamander that is going to feed on this invertebrate, okay? They are going to, the invertebrate are also going to be eaten by the shrews here, okay? So we are going to have a complex interaction of who is feeding on whom in the food web here. So here we have an example of food pyramid. So say that in this food pyramid, the biomass, or at the very basis of this pyramid, we have producers, and we have, let's say, 809 kilograms per meter square available of food, right? So of this amount of source of energy, only 37 grams worth of energy is going to be made available to the herbivore. Well, actually, no, let me correct that. The herbivore, after consuming that 809 grams worth of food, this is going to translate into only 37 grams worth of food in the herbivores, right? And that 37 grams worth of food is going to be made, only 11 grams is going to be made available to the next trophic level. And of that 11 grams per meter square, you only going to have 1.5 grams that is going to be made available to the next trophic level. So, which means that if this fish was to feed exclusively on this trophic level, they will need to eat a whole bunch so that the impact on here is going to be humongous. Now, in other words, let me put this from the perspective of a human. We eat cows, right? We eat cows. So cows are grazing animals. Now, I want you to think a minute. What amount of grass does it take to produce a T-bone steak? Let me repeat that. What amount of grass does it take to produce one T-bone steak? Right? So now, think about how many T-bone steaks you need to sustain your growth, to maintain your body, and live a healthy life. You would need a lot of T-bone steaks. Now, let's assume that you only eat exclusively steaks. So that means that you will have to grow a bunch of cows that are actually going to have a tremendous impact on our environment. That's why you cannot rely on eating cows exclusively, right? This is not going to be sustainable for your environment. That's not possible, right? So you have to diversify, right? Beyond other reasons, for that single reason that for sustainability of your ecosystem, you have to diversify your source of energy. All right, let's move on. So the next part now is going to be the biogeochemical cycle. And as we dive in the biogeochemical cycle, I want you to focus on two things. One, it's bio. Two, geo, right? And all of that in relation to chemicals, I should say, right? So bio, geo, chemicals. So this is the pathway by which chemicals are going to circulate through an ecosystem, right? Some specific example we are going to look at are the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. Without further ado, let's take a look at the water cycle. Now, whether you are addressing any of the cycles that I mentioned earlier, all the chemicals that we found in our environment are going to have what we call a reservoir. What is a reservoir? A reservoir is going to be where you are going to find the raw material that is not readily available for consumption. That's what a reservoir is. Some examples of those reservoirs are going to be fossil fuels, minerals in rocks, and sediments in oceans. Think, for instance, of a shell, right? A seashell, right? That seashell, it's not source of food for a consumer, right? It's not source of food for a consumer. So that shell has to break down before this chemical is made available. So the chemicals are stored in that shell. The chemicals are stored in a rock. The chemicals are stored in fossil fuel, right? These are the reservoirs. They are limited in terms of availability, right? Then we have the exchange pool. The exchange pool, it's where the chemicals are readily available for living organisms to consume and use, right? So, in the biogeochemical cycle, you are going to have the weather that is going to play a role. You are going to have living organisms that are going to play roles. You are also going to have the human activity that is going to play a role. So I mentioned to you the reservoirs. I told you about exchange pools, right? And we're going to have the chemicals that are cycled among producers, consumers, and decomposers. So this is the community, right? Human is going to have a role to play in the cycling of these chemicals. And the most interesting thing is that human activity is going to bypass the biogeochemical cycle to actually go from the reservoir, from the exchange pool, to directly the consumer, which is going to exacerbate the amount of chemicals that the community can deal with. Because you have an exacerbation of the amount of chemicals that the community can deal with, at the end of the day, we end up with a situation that we call pollution, right? We are going to address that a little later. So, water cycle. When we look at the water in the environment, we are going to have the water that is in oceans and rivers, water that is frozen, water that is found on the terrestrial environment as standing water in lakes. We're going to have water that flows in the stream. We're going to have water that is in the air because of evaporation. We're going to have water that is underground because of percolation. So all this water is going to flow within an ecosystem. So some water is going to evaporate, right, from the oceans and bodies of water. Other water is going to evaporate from the land because of all the trees, right? This water that evaporates goes in the atmosphere, right? Eventually, that water is going to come back down through precipitation, right? Here in an aquatic, in ocean environment and seas environment, and here on land, right? We're going to have some precipitations, and these precipitations are going to be in forms of rain, snow, hail, and other forms, right? So the water that filtrates and goes in the ground is going to end up in an area that we call the aquifer. This is groundwater. Now, that groundwater, can be obtained by digging wells, right? We have water that flows down the bodies of water, what we call runoffs, right? Because of the rains. Okay? So you have a normal cycle of water, and you have that cycle of water can be disturbed. It can be disturbed by human activity. How so? For instance, as we pump water from the ground up because of our need, right? For instance, to water our crops, right? We suck a lot of water from oceans and rivers and ponds and lakes because of our industries, right? We use a lot of water for many things. All right. So now, let's take a look at the carbon cycle. In the carbon cycle, carbon dioxide is the central chemical that is going to be used as an exchange material between the atmosphere and the living organisms. Plants obtain carbon dioxide. They combine that carbon dioxide with water to form sugars, right? That's why they are producers, okay? And they do this via photosynthesis, right? And after photosynthesis, the sugar that is produced is ultimately going to go into becoming a source of energy and nutrients for other organisms, right? Eventually, carbon dioxide is going to be returned to the atmosphere through the process of cellular respiration, right? So while carbon dioxide is obtained by plants, they incorporate carbon dioxide. Organisms that feed on plants are going to release carbon dioxide through the process of cellular respiration. So you have the cycle that goes on, right? We take out and we bring back the components. However, human activity can considerably affect the amount of carbon dioxide in the exchange pool. How so? Again, by human activity, right? By extracting chemicals, breaking down these chemicals, and releasing more carbon dioxide than the community can actually use, which at the end becomes a problem and again, pollution. All right, so here we have a graphic representation of the sources of carbon, right? Carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, right? That carbon dioxide is going to be used by producers, right? Producers are the main living components that are going to consume that carbon dioxide. And we have producers on a terrestrial environment, but also on the aquatic environment, right? What else? We are going to have carbon dioxide that is going to be released through the process of respiration, right? So we're going to have some carbon-based compounds that are going to run off in streams and rivers, right? And eventually they're going to be broken down, form into bicarbonate, and bicarbonate is going to be broken down into water and carbon dioxide, which is going to actually cause carbon dioxide to go back in the atmosphere, right? We're going to have some source of carbon underground, and there, that source of carbon underground is going to develop because of living components that instead of decaying or decomposing are going to not be decomposed but be trapped. And as they get trapped, they get transformed into coal, right? Into gas, natural gas, for instance, into fossil fuel, right? And eventually, because of human activity, right, we are going to deposit in the atmosphere a huge amount of carbon dioxide that our community will never know how to use in their lifetime. All right, so in terms of carbon cycle, we have that we human are burning fossil fuel, destroying forest, which causes an extra input of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere faster than actually consumers in the ecosystem can use that carbon dioxide. Other consequence of human activity, it's that carbon dioxide and other gases, including methane and nitrogen oxide, they are going to be emitted in the environment and are going to have some consequence in that environment. So these gases, right, that we mentioned up here are actually called greenhouse gases. Why do we call them greenhouse gases? We call them greenhouse gases because they end up forming a shield in the atmosphere that traps heat, right? And by trapping heat, they participate in causing our environment where we are thriving, where we are evolving, to actually warm up. And because this is happening rather at a global level, we call this global warming, right? So global warming is having a tremendous consequence on our environment. We see overall an increase in temperatures, right? In the United States here, there are a bunch of work that have been done that show an increase in temperature over time. And we see that winters are not as cold as before anymore. Springs start earlier than before. Summers are more hot than before. They're lasting longer than before, right? Resulting in a change in the pattern of things, including loss of habitat for these polar bears. We see some diseases developing, for instance, in Florida, in Texas, we see outbreaks of Zika virus, right? And the Zika virus is developing in these areas because of a population of mosquitoes that are multiplying, right? Because they are multiplying more than they used to, the mosquito, right? While the male mosquito does not feed on human blood, the female mosquito does feed on human blood. And the Zika virus occur in these mosquitoes, right? So the more the population of mosquitoes, or the more throughout the year, the most likely the chance to actually transfer Zika virus to the population, the human population, which causes problem, including babies that are born with heads that are smaller than normal, right? We call it microcephaly, but I'm not going to bug you with that. Okay, the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle, let me tell you that about 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas. That nitrogen gas in the atmosphere cannot be used directly as is by consumers, including plants, right? For plants to use nitrogen, now let me tell you this. Nitrogen is essential for nucleic acids, right? DNA, RNA, right? Without nitrogen, forget about nucleic acids. Without nitrogen, forget about proteins, right? Yet, producers such as plants do not have access to that nitrogen gas. But the question is, how do plants use nitrogen? Well, they rely on teeny tiny organisms, on microorganisms. These are bacteria. But they rely on particular bacteria that are called nitrogen fixing bacteria. So that those nitrogen fixing bacteria are going to convert nitrogen gas into ammonium, and from ammonium and nitrogen gas, we are going to have nitrate and nitrite. But this nitrate and nitrite and ammonium are actually these components that are essential for plants to produce nucleic acids and proteins, right? So we have nitrogen fixing bacteria that play a very important role. We have nitrifying bacteria. Nitrifying bacteria are going to convert ammonium to nitrate, right? And bacteria, again, are going to convert nitrate back to nitrogen gas. These are organisms that are called denitrifying bacteria. The process itself is called denitrification, right? So now you have so much bacteria in the ground. You have so much denitrifying bacteria. Now, here is the thing. Because of human activity, we bypass our biogeochemical cycle by us producing fertilizers, nitrate, ammonia, okay? And we are bringing in the environment much more nitrate and ammonium than bacterium need, so that we create, again, pollution, right? Okay? So, I want you to know that. So basically, I already mentioned all of this here, okay? So nitrogen gas is in the environment, in the atmosphere, okay? Now, we have nitrogen fixing bacteria that are going to play a role, right? You have nitrifying bacteria that are going to play a role to make available the nitrogen components that are needed for plants and other living organisms to thrive, right? Eventually, the nitrifying bacteria are going to cause nitrogen gas to be put back in the atmosphere, right? You're going to have human activity that is actually going to input in our environment bunch of nitrate, bunch of ammonium, causing pollution, and a particular condition that we call eutrophication. Eutrophication is when you have too much nutrients, right? This too much nutrients occur in bodies of water, including lakes, rivers, ponds, right? Causing an overgrowth of algae. And this overgrowth of algae is depleting the amount of oxygen in the water, which is causing fishes to die off. That's a problem. All right. So I told you about eutrophication. Okay. So this is because of the fertilizers that run off into lakes, rivers, and streams, right? Causing an overgrowth of living algae, causing fish to be killed, right? That's a problem. The burning of fossil fuels is going to cause acid deposition or acid rains, right? These acid rains are caused by nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide that are put in the atmosphere. And when there is precipitation, the precipitation is acidic, causing actually a destruction of the ecosystem. How so? We are going to have trees that are going to die off because of this acid deposition, right? So basically, these acids are going to cause some issues. And the other thing I need to say is that nitrogen oxide and hydrocarbon are going to react with each other to form what we call smog. Smog, it's a made-up word. It's a made-up word that is between smoke and fog. So that makes it smog, right? So smog, it's actually pollution, right? So we have smog that can actually create thermal inversion, right? So in a thermal inversion, now in a normal condition, first of all, in a normal condition, you have that the earth that has a bunch of heat is going to release heat to the air, right? So the warm heat is going to radiate back to the atmosphere, right? We're going to have the cool the cool heat here, and the cooler heat above, right? But in a case of a thermal inversion, well, we have the cool heat that is underneath because of the smog, right? We have a heat inversion layer here, which causes a trap of the cool air in the atmosphere and causing smog to develop, right? This is not a good news. So that's a bunch of pollution. Los Angeles actually experienced that situations many years ago, and the quality of air in LA is much better than it was even 30 years back. Okay. So the nitrogen cycle here, so we're going to have the factories that are releasing a lot of byproducts, right? And here we have the consequence of acid rains and also the consequences of some structures that we find in our cities, right? That are damaged by the acid deposition. Now, the phosphorus cycle is basically the phosphorus source. It's the rocks. Okay, the phosphorus source is the rocks. Now, as the rocks weather, this phosphorus is going to go from a solid form to small small particles to actually a breakdown into a form of phosphorus that is made available, right? So that source of phosphorus that is made available is going to be essential for the production of nucleic acids, right? You know that nucleic acids have phosphorus in them, right? So this phosphorus is the one after the weathering of rocks that is going to be used by organisms. However, because of human activity, we are digging and digging and digging, so we are accelerating the weathering process and making available in our environment more phosphorus than our community can actually deal with, right? So again, the natural way of phosphorus to occur in the community is by the natural weathering of rocks. That's how phosphorus gets in our environment. And then from there, plants are going to use that phosphorus. Microorganisms are going to use that phosphorus. And that phosphorus is going to be made available to consumers and so on. But because of our human activity, we are depositing more phosphorus than we really want and than our environment can handle. At some point, we have, again, eutrophication, what we saw for nitrogen, right? Because we produce fertilizers and we use it to make our lawn look really nice and everything. We use fertilizers for our crops, right? That is a major issue. So in the next chapter, we're going to talk about sustainability. What can we do to solve these problems? But that's another story. So when it comes to pollution, we are going to talk about two types of water pollutions. We're going to have the point source of pollution, which is a source that we can identify, we can tell that this is where the pollutant is coming from, right? And then we have non-point sources where we don't know where the pollutant is coming from. For instance, the pollutants that we are going to find in the Erie lake, right? Where are they coming from? They're coming from different places. We don't know exactly which specific place, right? But when we have a factory, we know that factory is producing a fertilizer, and in the process, they dump a bunch of things in the environment, right? We can specifically say, well, this factory is associated with this pollution, therefore, you need to do this and this and that. We know how to deal with it. But in a non-point source of pollution, we don't really know how to deal with it, right? These are the runoffs. All right. Finally, the last point of this chapter is going to be the biomagnification. Biomagnification is a term that means that you have an accumulation of pollutants in living organisms as we go from one trophic level to another trophic level, in so much that at the highest trophic level, you have such a huge accumulation of that pollutant so that it's affecting all the living organisms. But affecting all the living organisms, that's another story, right? But the biomagnification is the high concentration of that chemical in this living organism, right? We are going to particularly address the biomagnification of mercury, mercury being a heavy metal that is a problem for our environment. So the emission of mercury in our environment is a major problem. For instance, those who are extracting gold, right? Those who are extracting gold use mercury. It's now technically illegal to use mercury for gold extraction, but guess what? People still do it, and that is a major problem. So that mercury end up in our environment, which is going to cause serious health effects in human, fish, and wildlife, right? So the widespread of mercury contamination, it's a major problem, not only in the United States, but in the remainder of the world. I was telling you about gold extraction, right? Gold extraction abroad, right? Wetlands, reservoirs, and lakes are going to be affected because of human activity. Now, bioaccumulation, this is going to occur when an organism accumulates a contaminant in such way that they are not getting rid of that contaminant, right? They are actually accumulating it faster they can eliminate it, right? So that concentration is going to increase with trophic levels. I did tell you that, right? So when it comes to water pollution, what are the different sources of water pollution? Boy, there are many. There are many. Our cities are source of water pollution. The biomedical waste are source of water pollution. The industries, right, including industrial waste, the barnyard waste, crop dusting, the nuclear reactors, the oil extractions, and all the vessels that transport oil across the world, right? They're going to pollute water. The fertilizers runoffs. There are many sources of water pollution, which is a big issue. So I want you to review this table, right, of water pollution. So what are some reasons of eutrophication, right? Oxygen demanding waste, plant nutrients, sediments, thermal discharge, right? So in the oxygen demanding waste, we're going to have biodegradable organic compounds, for instance, sewage waste, sewage, waste from food processing plants, paper mills, and tanneries. We're going to have different sources of pollution of water. We have health hazards. What are the health hazards? Disease causing agents, right? Synthetic organic compounds, right? Inorganic chemical and minerals and radiations. So please review the slide, right? This slide is a very good slide to actually catch a lot of the things I mentioned toward the end of this chapter. So this is where we are going to stop this presentation. Thank you for your attention. Bye now.